Today on Pilot's Discretion, our guest is Todd Simmons from Cirrus Aircraft. He talks about selling GA to non-pilots, new approaches to aviation safety, and backcountry flying. Pilot's Discretion starts right now. Hello, pilots. I'm John Zimmerman, and thanks for listening to Pilot's Discretion from Sporties. Visit sporties.com/podcast for today's show links and access to our complete archive, and send us an email with your comments or guest ideas, podcast@sporties.com. Today, I'm joined by Todd Simmons, whose formal title is President Customer Experience at Cirrus, which means he leads all elements of sales, marketing, delivery, and flight training at the company. More than that, though, I think he's one of the visionaries who has really helped make Cirrus the best-selling piston airplane company in the world for the last 2 decades. Todd is a longtime pilot, flying everything from tail draggers to jets, and is also a board member at the Recreational Aviation Foundation. Todd, welcome to Pilot's Discretion.
Well, thank you, John. It's a privilege to be here, and thank you for all you do in the industry and at Sporties, and including this podcast to spread the good word as well. So it's my privilege to be with you today and to share a few thoughts with you and answer some of your questions.
Well, let's talk about how you approach personal aviation in general. Cirrus is well known for having a distinctive approach to selling general aviation, small airplanes, pilot lifestyle in general. Many companies talk about specs. You'll hear about cruise speed, fuel burn. But when you talk about Cirrus, you hear about the Cirrus Life. It's much more of a lifestyle conversation. Obviously, the strategy has worked. You've just delivered your 10,000th SR series airplane. But first, tell us what you mean by the Cirrus Life and then why you think it's important.
John, you've hit the nail on the head. And I've been at Cirrus coming up on 17 years. And half of that time I was at headquarters in Duluth, Minnesota, and half is where I am right now at the Vision Center in Knoxville, Tennessee. And we'll talk about the importance of the Vision Center as it's a part of answering that question as well. But when we think about Cirrus, we think about the number one goal we have is increasing participation engagement in aviation. That may sound a little bit interesting. That's not necessarily about specs and performance. We prioritize that as well. We think we build the best airplanes in the world. And I think, as you hinted, the market thinks the same thing in our categories, given the best-selling nature of both the SR-22 platform and the Vision Jet. But I think we also think about, almost as simplest terms, what does an airplane do to enable your lifestyle? That's a little bit different than the specs of the airplane, and that sort of encapsulates how we think about it. An airplane offers you a capability and utility and can enable what you want to do. And by enabling, I mean small business, regional business, reaching your family, your second home, regional businesses in terms of those 400, 500, and 600 mile trips. It's very familiar within the Cirrus community for franchisees, for example, where driving or flying the airlines can be very difficult. So there's a whole bunch of ways that I think you think about how the airplane enables the rest of your life. And in some ways, that's almost the simplest version of the Cirrus Life. Now, we certainly start with the best airplanes and the best specs and the best performance. We prioritize safety, and we'll come to some of those things in a minute, and speed and useful load and all those things. But at the end of the day, we go further than that. We prioritize safety. We prioritize the relationship between the owner and the pilot, in some cases the non-pilot, and the airplane, so that airplane is enabling the rest of their life. That's what winning looks like for Cirrus Aircraft.
You mentioned non-pilots, and I've heard the stat that some are a quarter to a third of your customers are not pilots, have no real aviation connection when they first start talking to Cirrus, and some of them will learn to fly and buy an airplane. Some of them will not and have a professional pilot fly them. So I think that's unique in the GA world, at least the scale of that. How do you attract those customers? Is it the fully managed experience with training and pilots and maintenance? Is it the airplane? If you're talking to a completely non-aviation person, how do you win that customer over?
John, I appreciate you answering that question because you're right that I think Cirrus certainly prioritizes, I just said, growing participation and engagement. But at the same time, if you looked in the past, we probably, in all reality, if I can use the pre-pandemic kind of time period, the reality of new to aviation, the term we use, was probably closer to about 15%. It may have trended a little higher than that on occasion. And then there we saw sort of in the pandemic or immediate post-pandemic period, that number almost spike as high as 40%. That's kind of what you're hinting at. My goodness, how would that many people, normally in economic distress or contractual recession, it's oftentimes aviation that leads the way down, is the last one to come back up. And this was the opposite of that. I see the value of aviation. I see the value of how that can change my life. And so I think at Cirrus, the way that we do that, well, let me finish that thought one more about, so where are we today? We're probably closer to about 25%. So you're right, that's pretty high, and that probably is higher than some might think about. You're bringing folks new to aviation, to use your term, and into the capability and utility. And I'm going to go beyond general aviation. We'd like to think at Cirrus that we not only sort of own, but have really owned and grown the category personal aviation. And what I mean by that is personal aviation, whether you are a pilot sitting in the front left seat of an airplane, you personally are defining how you use the airplane and what the mission is. But you may be a non-pilot too that sits in a different seat in the airplane, but just the same way, you're defining the mission, even if you're using pilot services, as you hinted at a moment ago, is something we offer at Cirrus too. I think the gateway into a non-pilot or new to aviation, participating, either becoming a pilot, becoming an owner, and at the end of the day, getting the benefit of the airplane, is about the ecosystem around the airplane. For so long, aviation, I think, is focused on, as you said, the performance and capability and a lot of a stat sheet, and those are important. But when you go beyond that, making it easy to own, meeting our customer expectations on their terms, and their terms are often defined by other experiences outside of aviation, whether it's the vehicle they own. Certainly with electrification of cars, you've seen a new kind of standard in the way you own an asset like that. Their second home, resorts, fine restaurants. I could go on, but I think we all know the things we're talking about. Our customers' expectations are being defined on those terms, and those reach well beyond aviation. And that's the way that Cirrus, and I've been very fortunate in my time, that's the way that we've thought about it. We're not necessarily looking to aviation as our benchmark, but quite frankly, we're looking well beyond aviation as the benchmark. And I've been privileged, as you said, we've delivered 10,000 SRs now, just past that, just at Oshkosh a few weeks ago. That beautiful airplane was sitting there. And now we're up to probably 560 Vision Jet. So I've been around for about 7,500 of those SRs, and I had to check myself the other day and said, my goodness, I've actually been here a time. It's been the privilege of a lifetime to bring some of those new people in, but to also try to meet them on their terms of how an airplane can be a part of their life. And perhaps not the same as you and me. Aviation runs in my blood and my family, and we'll cover that in a moment. But at the same time, when it doesn't, I think whether it's ownership, maintenance, flight training, subscriptions, parts, access to the airplane, hangar, insurance, medical, all the things that are key parts and their requirements. There's no shortcuts in any of them, but how we make them easy and how we have a cohesive ecosystem around the airplane so that the airplane becomes one piece of a much broader solution. And when we do that, that smooths the way in. I like to say, when it's easy to own an airplane, easy to get training in an airplane, easy to get good access to the things you need to own an airplane, it's easy, if you will, to buy the airplane. And that's the way we look at it. The airplane's only one piece of the equation. The ecosystem that it lives in is actually more important. And that almost goes back to your first question. That is the essence of the Cirrus Life, making sure all of those pieces are there so you get the maximum utility and capability of what only a personal airplane and a general aviation airplane can provide.
Yeah, I think Cirrus clearly does a great job at that. You all address the total ownership experience, I think, better than anybody. And part of that, I would say, is that safety piece, which you brought up. Cirrus, I think, has tackled the safety issue head on. There's some pilots who say we talk about safety too much in this industry, and we read accident reports too much, and why don't we stop talking about safety because it just scares people off. I suspect you would disagree and say that if you don't have the safety conversation, that potential customer is going to be having that conversation anyway, so we might as well address it. Is that fair?
I think it is, and I agree. I appreciate the way you just characterize it. We prefer that head on, and from day one, as you well know, the hallmark of safety is almost embodied in one of the features that's been on every single airplane we've ever delivered. I'm talking about the Cirrus airframe parachute system. But that goes back to, our ethos, our DNA, the core of who we are. And you're right, not in any way, shape, or form, being fearful of safety or not wanting to address it, but take quite the opposite approach that for so many, you just mentioned new to aviation especially, the safety question is going to be on the table and understanding how to be a safe pilot. So there's so many dimensions of this. The technology is one of them, and I just mentioned CAPS. there are 267 people today, as you and I talk right now, that have been safely returned to their families because of that incredible system. When every other option was no longer available, there was one left in that catastrophic incident or that occasion where there's been loss of control of the airplane. We've got one more option, and that's, of course, CAPS. And that's about 130 events. 267 people returned their lives. So the data speaks loudly for itself. Two of those events have been in the Vision Jet. The rest have been in SR. So even there, we see that. And then there's another amazing technology that now finds itself on the Vision Jet. And I'm talking about the safe return button, as we call it. And that's an autoland feature in partnership with Garmin. And of course, with a single push of that button by anyone on the airplane, including easy access to a passenger, the plane will bring itself to a complete stop on a runway without any additional human intervention. Think of that for a moment. The age of autonomous is actually here, and now that technology is being integrated onto the airplane such that the passenger can have that confidence. Now, I like to say a simple, easy to remember one-liner here, and that is, if the pilot brakes, pull the chute. If the plane brakes, pull the chute, and if the pilot brakes, push the button. And so you can remember that's how those two things live sort of symbiotically. If the airplane brakes, pull the chute, and if the pilot brakes, push the button. And I think when you understand that technology is living in the background in both those cases, that inspires so much confidence on board the airplane, because we know that in personal aviation, not only do the passengers on the airplane, but the pilot, there's a special relationship with all those people. And we work to keep that relationship close. We don't separate, if I can use terms like, upper deck or lower deck or the cockpit that's sealed. Quite the opposite. We've got a close connection to the people up in the front of the airplane, and they're easily visible and having a conversation with the people that are in the seats behind the airplane. So we want safety to be part of that equation. The other piece of that that's so important, and I'll do the other side of it, is our training. You talked about that. Focusing on training from day one, we have this program called Cirrus Approach, and it's really comprehensive in that every part of training, significant investments, not unlike your organization, in rich media, rich content, the way that people learn today, and making sure that not only can we teach, I'll say within the Cirrus ecosystem and the Cirrus training system, I akin that to the type rating that's required, of course, by FAR and the Vision Jet program. But we would almost go so far as to say we look at there are hallmarks of a type rating program. Given the excellent safety record when there's a type rating, we bring some of those same hallmarks into the SR program, meaning prioritizing safety from that training perspective. So not only do we have the right decision-making, almost 100% of the time we're talking about single pilot operations and single pilot decision-making, but you've also got the ability to safely and appropriately use the safety systems on board, two of which I said, and there are others. And that complete system of both hardware technology, state-of-the-art technology, and training systems, Vision Jet type rating, Cirrus Approach we call it, and even a third one called Embark being SR type-specific training, particularly in the pre-owned world. So that Cirrus is new to that customer, but maybe a pre-owned airplane. Cirrus is incurring the cost at its cost to give that new owner to them appropriate safety training in the airplane. So we look to have a comprehensive hardware to software training to human interactions to their actions in the cockpit, using all available technologies, including simulation. And even at Oshkosh, just a few weeks ago, demonstrating for the first time, again, I know something's important to you, some new AI capabilities, some new products by, of course, Apple and the Vision Pro goggles. It's just some amazing things. My goodness. We are just on the cusp of a new age that's being heralded by those technologies and how we can think of training safely and pilots. And so Cirrus is looking at all of these things as a comprehensive program, and that, to your point, it is the number one first priority in all that we do. And it's had so much to do with why we're where we are in the marketplace and the market saying, this is the way we want to approach personal aviation.
I'm glad you brought in the training piece of that, because it's an interesting case study to me. Early in the Cirrus deliveries, the SR-22 and the SR-20 had the CAP system, had that parachute, wasn't saving a lot of lives because pilots, I feel like, didn't really understand how to integrate it into part of their standard operating procedures. And over the course of a few years there, Cirrus, the broader Cirrus community, Cirrus flight instructors, type clubs, really made a push to integrate CAPS into training. And I think you've seen the benefits of that over the last 5 or 10 years, where pilots aren't just assuming there's a red handle there. They're making it part of their call outs, part of their checklist, part of their recurrent training. I think there's a lesson there for the broader aviation industry that it's very important to have the technology there to save your life potentially, or even on a lower level, shed workload or improve your decisions. But until it's thoughtfully integrated into the training, both initial and recurrent, it really can't have the full impact. And I think that's what we've seen to a large extent with CAPS.
John, you are spot on, and thank you for doing your homework at the depth you've done it to recognize that transition. You're right. We're a little, quite frankly, frustrated early on that the plane has been built to be a safer airplane, but statistically, we're not seeing where it's at the safety levels, trending the way we want to go. And it's exactly what you just said. The technology and the capability, the optionality was on the airplane, but it simply wasn't being used in the right time, place, or being used the way it should or as often as it should. That probably started even in the 08, 09 as we began to rethink, what might we do? And we realized it, if I can say it in this way, it wasn't a hardware problem, it was a software problem. And I mean software, a human interaction problem, and a training and teaching opportunity. And it really took root in about the 2011, 2012 timeframe. That was the genesis of what I just said. What started as Cirrus approach. We're going to rethink and almost go back to the drawing board, reestablish, reteach, create new materials that does exactly what you just said, which is if we can also teach the right times, the recognizing to use the safety system at the right times in the right places where in the past that was not happening. And sure enough, we saw the safety record. You almost can look and see the year we started that and match up. And here we sit today, quite frankly, within all of GA, when you think of turbines all the way down to the smallest general aviation airplane, Cirrus sitting between a half and a third, if you will, below the industry average because of this incredible safety system on the airplane. So we were not going to rest until that number is zero. But at the same time, we certainly taught ourselves and taught the market and our owners the way to approach both, again, hardware technology and teaching and how to keep on going with that. And we've made incremental investments even since then in the kind of materials we put together, speaking just a moment ago about digital content, rich content online, recognizing the kind of pilots, owner pilots, that are not, if you will, professional pilots, so recognizing their lives and the best way to teach. And finally, it's even shown up in a way that might not even be expected, and that is with the launch of Generation 7, the current SR platform in January of 2024, you saw a redesign, if you will, rethink of the very cockpit itself. And some of that it primarily will focus around touchscreen integration and touchscreen controllers. But the philosophy and ethos behind that is really what drove the jet architecture, John, which is when you make it simpler and easier to fly, simpler is safer. You're reducing that pilot workload. You're taking some of that decision-making out and you're automating it. You're reducing those number of functions. And when you actually find that simplification, you find that pilots can be safer pilots because digital autopilots are working in the background, digital smart servos are working in the background, electronic stability protection is working in the background. All those things are working in concert with the simplified workload of the pilot. That increases safety. So it shows back up yet again in the way we think about technology and innovation in the airplane. Specifically, as that example in G7, we saw some of the strongest positive market reception of that in January of just this year. So the market was very ready for us to redesign the interior of the airplane and very ready to see some of that learning from the Vision Jet cockpit come down in, if you will, into the SR cockpit. And that's exactly what we've done. That improves safety when we do it like that.
One of the other hallmarks of Cirrus's approach is the amount you do direct with the customer. You mentioned you have the facility there in Knoxville, which is a beautiful facility with training and delivery and everything. You have the training products you put out there. You have the Cirrus Standardized Instructor Pilot Program. The philosophy obviously is to give that total ownership experience, but why do you think more companies don't have that level of high touch throughout the entire process? Is it just the investment? Is there some difference of strategy there for the reasons that Cirrus goes so deep on so many elements of this?
I got to give credit where it's due, and I would almost go all the way back to our founders, Dale and Alan Klappmeyer, and of course that, boy, their vision at the time is just remarkable where this company is today. And, there's so many stories of similar ideas that didn't make it. And then there's such the rare few exceptions. And I'm fortunate enough to have been at Cirrus in the time I've been, and certainly at the time when Dale continued on as both CEO, co-founder and CEO, and has been such an integral part of the company. You really have to credit those founders and those two brothers, I think, for having a vision that really speaks to what you just said is, making it easier to own, making it easier to participate, making safety such a key part. Even what we have all the way to today, the Vision Center, you're almost hinting at how we look at marketing, quite frankly, just simply looking beyond aviation as it exists today or up to now. We're all standing on the shoulders of giants. Let's be clear. None of us would be here without so many incredible thinkers before us. But at the same time, if we're going to increase participation, as I said earlier, and increase engagement, you're going to have to reach folks that are not otherwise in, they weren't necessarily out of the airline mold. They weren't created in military pilot. They may not any longer have had family members that were involved in the military or global conflict, a lot of the things that drove aviation participation in decades past. So we've got to go find ways outside of aviation and, again, meet customers a little bit on their terms. And I think Dale and Alan's vision of being direct, if you will, we're not going to have, if I can use the terms, a dealer between us and the customer. That's a solid straight line. We want that customer in our ecosystem. We want to train them the way that we train because we prioritize safety. We prioritize that ecosystem. We want them within our network to be getting that direct. And I think you've seen that happen. And to be candid, in some other sets, who knew, whether talked about electric cars a moment ago in Tesla, or we talked about some other products where you see this sort of modality going on within channels of being direct. Now, why don't others do that? I can't speak for all of them. The reality is there's some legacy in this industry. Sort of pre-internet information exchange was different, access to airplanes. But if you think of the high portability of an airplane, the high mobility of an airplane, you think about what the internet, the digital age that we live in, you really almost move beyond this idea of physical access. Information access is instantaneous. And so I think we move beyond that. It's just fantastic that about 25 or 30 years ago, the people at the time running a much smaller company than the one today said, we're going to go direct. And I was just coming on board a bit after that, but I'm very familiar with the stories and the decision making that got to that. And I think to connect some dots that we've already had on this conversation, what I like to say is Cirrus is a company of big ideas. An airplane that has a full airframe parachute on board that can bring itself safely to the ground is a big idea. A single engine Vision jet with a V-tail with a button you can push that can land itself is a big idea. Our direct relationship, John, with our customers, owners, and operators in the community is a big idea. And quite frankly, I think it equally as big as this thing we call the Cirrus Life. It's about more than the airplane. It's about how the airplane enables the entire rest of your life. We have a small set of big ideas, and I just named 4 of this very short list, and they all are just important. And you'll notice 2 of those were airplanes. 2 of those were as big or bigger than the airplane about the way that we think at Cirrus. And again, that direct relationship and this thing we call the Cirrus Life. In all fairness, that came around the 2010, 2011 timeframe. There is a story that I got to be part of about writing on the back of a napkin and a little bit of the epiphany of, we're not an airplane hardware company. We're not an airplane manufacturing company, not an airplane sales company. My goodness, we're a lifestyle company. And what we meant by that is taking it further, the Cirrus Life. So I've sort of named them almost in a bit of a timeline as well, but we're now about a decade and a half into the Cirrus Life, and it has had incredible sticking power. We've even taught ourselves that was one of those big ideas that have been incredibly important, if quite frankly, a beacon or a North Star to this company of the way that we think. So to the extent that's the secret sauce, I just told it to you, and anybody else that wants to hear it, that's how we look at it. I think when we say focused on those principles and again, meeting customers within those principles, I think the rest, as they say, begins to take care of itself. And we've been the beneficiary of great growth because that's how we think it at Cirrus.
Todd, let's take a quick break. And when we come back, I want to switch to backcountry flying.
Earn all your pilot ratings and keep your flying skills sharp with Sporty's Pilot Training Plus. This all-inclusive membership unlocks Sporty's complete library of award-winning video courses so you can learn anywhere you have your phone, tablet, or laptop. For one annual fee, you get access to over $1,500 in courses, a smart investment in your flying career. Plus, enjoy free shipping every day of the year at sporties.com and apply for one of our 3 annual flight training scholarships. Learn more at sporties.com/pilot training. Now, back to Pilot's Discretion.
We are back with Todd Simmons, who is definitely not just a Cirrus guy. Before Cirrus, he was president of Cub Crafters, and these days he still spends a lot of time flying tail draggers in the backcountry, something he comes by honestly, as he mentioned, coming from an aviation family. Todd, this type of flying, backcountry tail draggers, bush planes, whatever you call it, it's really exploded in popularity over the last decade. I know you come to it from a family of aviators, but if I'm just learning about this, I saw a great video on YouTube. How do I get started in this world?
Well, that's a good one, and I'll answer that question in the order you ask it by starting a little with my family and how just simply fortunate and lucky I am to come from the family that I do. My grandfather on my dad's side was a B-26 pilot in World War II and a military aviator, and went on to a prolific career outside the military. On my mother's side, her father was a crop duster, and then we come down, one generation to my dad's generation. All 3 of my dad and 2 brothers. One was a helicopter pilot in the Navy. My dad, a flight surgeon, flight medic in the Army of all things. And then his brother, a prolific engineer, ultimately at Beach Aircraft and the chief structures engineer on the Beach Starship. So, boy, my blood runs deep in that. And then I've been fortunate. My brother, we're both pilots. And I'm so proud to say that my son, who I think you also know through some other channels. So here are 4 generations of Simmons pilots. So if I say nothing else today to you is how lucky I am to be from this family and how good aviation has been to me. One of the ways it's been to me is back on my mother's side. Some of my earliest experiences were at the time in the front seat of a J3 Cub because my uncle was in the back seat, and then later let me be in the back seat after I was ready to solo and, sort of tail dragger. But who knew back in, the early 80s, and I'm dating myself, who knew then that might be such an important part? And that almost tail dragger, a little bit tube and fabric, grass strip aviation. There's a small airport just outside of a small town in south of Atlanta in Sonoy, Georgia called Big T. My mother's maiden name is Tinsley, so that's the family airstrip way back in the day, and it's sort of grown up ever since. Well, if I fast forward through sort of my career, I had the opportunity in the early 2000s after some grad school and time in both Delta and American Airlines to head far west, quite frankly, in Washington State. And you mentioned it, the Cub Crafters. And at that point, the routes already I was flying. I was fortunate enough to saved up everything I possibly found and have an older Super Cub, but I had already been a little bit bitten by the bug. And being at Cub Crafters and making that decision to move at the time from Atlanta, Georgia, out to Yakima, Washington, and what a great move it was. Although you don't know that then. I got to be part at the time of the development of first the Sport Cub, and that was the advent of LSA, as we all remember. That's where it is today, and the ASTM certification rules. And then I was actually there even until the initial testing of what was the Carbon Cub and some of the very short takeoff and just incredible capability of those airplanes. So all along the way, though, I'm in my spare time, if you will, my weekend time and evening time, finding time to be in that Super Cub and then ultimately into some of the Cub Crafters products, and including even today. I mentioned my son, he's recently with another friend built a Carbon Cub, so it still runs deep. But, for 25 years now, if not a little bit longer, I think participating in this thing we call backcountry and, all different levels of it, from the weekend grass strip to, maybe we think of what's happening in Bentonville, Arkansas, and those trips, and now Idaho, Utah, Montana, Wyoming, and even in Alaska, this sort of almost the purest form, in some cases, of bush flying. I've been fortunate to do almost all of those things along the way, and it just speaks to my passion. And again, how fortunate I am to, whether it's tail dragger flying or Cirrus piston flying in the SR, the Vision Jet flying, I get to do all of those things. But I think, as you and many other people know, my heart is so much in that tail dragger and in backcountry flying. And then actually helping other people come into it. To your question about coming into it, you're correct. I think that you're correct in as much as I think we are in a process of developing more pathways into it. The Backcountry Safety Institute, AOPA, is a fantastic one. An organization I'm associated with, while not a teaching organization, is an awareness organization. I'm talking about the Recreational Aviation Foundation, is an awareness of where some of these strips are and how we protect them and what they mean. And we can circle back to that in just a moment. There's quite a few prolific instructors that are kind of the same time frame that I am and accessing them. But I could not agree more that someone that wants to participate, I encourage you, if I can say the phrase, go slow to go fast. Go slow to understand airplane performance. Go slow to understand density, altitude, especially when you get out west in the summer days. Go slow to understand canyon flying and approach speeds and airplane and being spot on your numbers and so many things that when you develop that proficiency and that refinement, you actually open up, some capabilities, but you've got to develop those things. So sometimes, if you will, you see some of the videos out there and they're so compelling and impressive from very high altitudes and very, very, very short strips. But the reality is there's just some incredibly capable aviators who are doing that, have a lot of experience. And so I want to just caution against jumping and going too fast. As I say, as you and I know, and I've talked in the past too, I have an experience in my own background now, just coming up on 6 years, where I unfortunately was involved myself in a very bad airplane accident. And when I go back and piece it together, like so many do, in fact, I was very privileged to take time with the AOP Air Safety Institute, and even EAA and Garmin and the RAF, all of them combined of spending time, quite frankly, owning and the mistakes I made and some of the poor decisions I made on that one flight that ended up being very consequential, and somehow take what was a incredibly challenging situation and turning into a learning opportunity. So that's how committed I am, I think, to finding those places where we can learn more about safety, sharing those stories. And I encourage anyone wanting to get into backcountry. It is incredible. I could not encourage people more to pursue learning more about that, but do it through the lens of safety and do it through the lens of learning as you go, just like any skill in your life, developing proficiency. And as you do that, I think you'll open up new vistas and new opportunities in flying that you could have never imagined. My airplane has taken me to places I could never have otherwise gotten to any other way. And it's that simple, and that's what makes it magic.
Yeah, go slow to go fast is great advice there. There's so much tribal knowledge, I think, in the world of backcountry flying. So many things you really can't learn until you've done it. It's hard to read a book and understand some of that.
And there are some great books out there. There are some wonderful folks that have published on backcountry flying, and you're right. I mean, just recently, Dick Williams and some of his, I can use some of his names. They've just done fantastic work. And you read those books, and I encourage that so much. There are none better on the subject, but then you have to put some of that into practice as well. I mentioned just a moment ago as a parallel topic also that I'm fortunate to be a board member on the Recreational Aviation Foundation, and that sort of is part and parcel to most of my passion. Oddly, at the end of the day, I think Recreational Aviation Foundation is as much a land conservation organization, but incredibly targeted and specific land conservation. And I'm talking about backcountry strips. I'm talking about the places that if we don't protect our access to them, we can lose access to them. And that happened many, many times. To be fair, a lot of Idaho, for example, to some cases, Wyoming, Montana, others get a little bit more airtime than some other places in the country, but it's a national organization with a board members, that, including my colleagues, that are from around the country, and incredibly active, if I can say, membership or group of supporters numbering close to 10,000. They're each and every one sort of committed to this same mantra of developing and creating and preserving and maintaining these backcountry strips. And so that's, again, a way to put into practice these things I've talked about or what I believe in. And I encourage others to, theraf.org. If I can encourage you to visit the site and understand what the organization's all about. And in a nutshell, it's what I just said about protecting these places. And I think we have to remain vigilant. And when we protect them and we exercise good stewardship and good safety and incredibly good backcountry etiquette, which is, we're not tagging strips, we're not doing touch and goes, but we're respecting the environment that we're in. I think when we do all these things, there's a great path forward to make sure these places that only an airplane can take you remain open for generations to come. And there'll be stories long after me of generations far beyond you and me that continue to have access to these places because we have the good sense today to work to protect these incredibly valuable places.
Yeah, it's a great organization. We've had folks from the RAF on before and strong supporters of them. Okay, Todd, we always end this podcast with a lightning round we call Ready to Copy. So I'll ask some questions on a variety of topics here, and you read back with your quick answer. You ready to copy?
All right, I'll give it a go.
What is one thing the general aviation industry should do to promote itself better? You've given a lot of advice about how Cirrus does it. If there's one thing you could snap your fingers, what should we as an industry do better?
Boy, there's maybe a bunch of different answers to that, but maybe I'll take this one and say that I think that the generations, the media savvy, the social media savvy, the digital savvy, the online savvy, just as generations coming behind us or the next ones, I think learning to understand how we can use that medium and media, and some already are, and I applaud your organization for that. But I think we can continue to invest in the power of sight, sound, and motion that comes in ways that was hard for us to imagine when we're growing up and get engaged in aviation. I see that as one of the ways I think to have reach into the next generation and then some. So that's sort of one. Aviation sometimes rightly, I think it's accused of not being very good in marketing. So this is another version of what I may have said before. You've got to reach people on their terms. And I think aviation probably could do a better job of recognizing that the terms we came to aviation on are different than the ones today, and maybe adjusting our thinking about how we reach others that can approach aviation and come to it and see its value differently, given the ways that we can communicate. Bit of a long answer to your question, but I think there's something in there. We've got to reach people on their terms and let them experience the incredible power and value of personal aviation.
What is one myth about Cirrus airplanes you'd like to bust?
The parachute, I'll just say it right now, we chose to put it on the airplane. If we go back, it's, hey, the parachute, they had to do it. They couldn't certify. That's all. None of that. We made a conscious choice that, John, I'll be very candid here, that if for some reason a pilot has gotten himself or herself into a spin, you have to work pretty hard to do that. Why would we think you could safely get yourself out of it with manipulating the controls in a way other than the ones you just did to induce a spin? We've got a much, much better solution. So I could spend a lot of time talking about myths at Cirrus, but I'll just start with the parachute one. Let me be clear. We chose to put it on the airplane, and we're dang glad we did, because it has proven itself and it's proven out what I've just said. We now have a way to solve that problem and not put pilots at additional risk that may have gotten themselves in a situation they never intended to be in.
Describe flying the Vision Jet in 5 words or less.
Privilege of a lifetime.
Great answer.
Man, I'm just a Super Cub pilot, dude. I a small grass strip in South Georgia, and I was raised in a farm in South Carolina. And when I look out and imagine that I'm flying this Vision Jet around and somehow, my life lined up for me to be able to get to there, the privilege of almost the magic carpet that it is, and that of the goodness, 11 to 1200, I can't remember how many type readings I've given. Mine was number 34. And I'll not forget that day when I look at myself and say, boy, that you've come to here is the privilege of a lifetime to be able to experience that. So, that's a gift that I count many blessings for, to be where I am and to be able to have access and be able to have fly these airplanes that I do. The Vision Jet's the top of that list.
What is more important for pilots flying a high-performance airplane like the SR-22? Better stick and rudder skills or better avionics management?
Oh, man, John, that one's interesting. I almost would say pilot proficiency, and combining those two things. We do see we want in the Cirrus system, and we do see people. We'd like to see if I can say it, your feet a little more active on rudders and learning that way. Although not being behind the avionics and having to hunt and peck. And again, I just mentioned how we're changing that with G7. So I think I'm gonna take the middle ground on that one and not pick one or the other. I almost am going to wrap it all up into pilot proficiency, pilot professionalism, and quite frankly, airmanship. I would tell you that decision-making actually encapsulates both of the things you just said. And that's what I'd have at the top of that list is airmanship, proficiency, and decision-making.
You passed the test. That was a trick question, obviously. The answer is both. There's no reason those have to be at odds with each other. So well done.
I just had a wordy way of getting there.
What one skill is important to master to be a good backcountry pilot? Obviously, lots of them, but if you had to pick one, I want to go do backcountry flying. What's something I should polish up right now?
hitting exactly your numbers and performance of the airplane. Can you put it on that spot right there? For some people that's the green dot, once a year at Oshkosh. That's not what I'm talking about, John. I think that understanding your airplane's performance, understanding its tall speed at every characteristics, at every flap setting, power setting, density, altitude, but all that rolls up into absolutely understanding your airplane's performance and making sure that when you go fly that day in that environment, that both pilot and airplane are ready for that mission. And that means understanding your airplane's performance and be able to actually execute to the performance of the airplane so you can do the things that you need to do in the backcountry, which is oftentimes about touchdown speed, touchdown location, all of those things. So it really is mastery of the performance and the numbers, hitting the spots with the airplane. If you need to get tuned up before you get to the backcountry on those skills.
What's your favorite backcountry strip?
Oh man, goodness gracious! I've there's a couple back in Idaho that I like so much. I mean, Ryan Field with the RAF is one of the best. Schaefer Meadows is one of the best. I know some people have been to Johnson Creek, but I gotta be honest. There's one called Shearer. There's one called Graham. There's one called Atlanta. My favorite backcountry strip, John, is the one where only my airplane can take me, along with my combination fishing rod or my tent or my sleeping bag. So that means there's a lot, but there's a few out there, and there's even a few places in my neck of the woods here in East Tennessee that are on some pieces of property, but they're still remote here, and without giving them special names, only my airplane can get me there. So it's the one that checks that box on that day. How about that?
Fair enough. I'm going to put you on the spot again. What's your favorite backcountry airplane?
This might surprise. Man, I love Carbon Cubs, and I love what they do, and that's sort of table stakes. But if I actually make it one day, I've got my eye on a Kodiak. I think kind of the thought behind that airplane and what it does, and you get to take all your things with you, all your friends and everybody's equipment, and you're glamping when you're in that. And then it can go to some of those very same places. A great colleague of ours is Mark Brown, and I look at that guy and his life and the way he flies that airplane. So I guess I'm at some risk here that I didn't name either a Cirrus or a Carbon Cub, but if I make it one day, I'm going to go find a Kodiak, I think, and take all my friends and all our stuff with us, and we're going to go to the backcountry where only a Kodiak can take us.
That's a fair answer. I was thinking tail dragger, but I would definitely take a Kodiak some of those places. So I'll let it slide. You mentioned your uncle who worked on the Beech Starship. Is that airplane underrated or overrated in 2024? Was it ahead of its time, or did it just miss the mark?
Well, how do I answer that? It's underrated or over? It was underrated. Who knew that in the early 80s that, they're paving the way for us at Cirrus today. The complexity then of that airplane, the complexity of all carbon fiber. I mean, my goodness, they're looking at ply cutters and even talking outside the industry. They're working with an FAA that all of this is new. Some extremely complex issues on the weight, managing weight, stick shakers, some of the HERF, high intensity radio. I mean, all that mesh in that stuff today that we almost take as table stakes, and we look at composite, all the way up to not just at Cirrus, but the 787. Now we see that they were ahead of their time. I think the thing's an engineering marvel. I can't speak for Beech at the time, that is that airplane going to replace the King Air? That's probably hard today for us to think that 40 or 50 years ago, that's what they were thinking. But, whether they knew it or not, I think they paved the way. They were ahead of their time. And you still see one or two around today, as you know. Unfortunately, most of them are no longer around. But I look at it today, and boy, it's hard not to just stare at it for a minute and think, my goodness, 40, 45, 50 years ago, that was what they were thinking. Somebody deserves a lot of credit for the kind of visionary that was, and it simply was ahead of its time as far as marketing and commercialization. I think the regulatory bodies weren't ready for it. I think the market wasn't ready for it, but man, I love that thing. And I think, again, that so many of us, without perhaps even knowing it, we're standing on the shoulders of giants today, and that's one of them that paved the way in composites and some of the aerodynamic and materials strength capabilities that airplane heralded. We just didn't know it until much later.
We always go outside aviation for at least one question, and I discovered that you're a Georgia Tech grad. I lived in Atlanta as a kid, so I was always a fan, and so I've got to ask about college football. You were there in 1990 when the Ramblin' Wreck shared a national championship with Colorado. So if we had had the college football playoff back then and Georgia Tech had played Colorado, who they shared the national championship with, who wins that game?
Well, you know that Georgia Tech wins that game, and they won anyway because I think Notre Dame, who got 5 downs, Colorado got 5 downs,
That's right.
and if I could talk to it, and I was at the national championship game in 1980, the Citrus Bowl, when the Yellow Jackets beat the Nebraska Cornhuskers, and that same college year, Georgia Tech went to the Final Four, so that was the heyday at Georgia Tech, and I bleed white and gold. And I've mentioned a few people in my background. I was the 4th consecutive generation of brothers, no less. My great-granddad and his brother, my granddad and his brother, my dad and his brother, and myself and even my brother went to Georgia Tech. And when my son went, most recently, the 5th consecutive generation. So the Georgia Tech question is alive and well in the Simmons family. And, every now and then we're pretty good in football. It seems to come around every decade or two. And we seem to be back at one of those points. So 1990 was a long time ago. There's a lot of enthusiasm on the flats, as they say this year. But the white and gold and the Ramblin' Wreck and the Yellow Jackets run deep in the Simmons household, my friend.
That's great. If you ever want to trigger a Georgia fan, which I have many friends who are Georgia fans, all you have to tell them is who won more national championships in the 1990s, Georgia Tech or Georgia? And the answer is Georgia Tech, and that'll really get their blood boiling. So, all right.
Well, under the ending comment of the can't make this up, love my daughter to death, and in her major, she actually is entering her junior year at the University of Georgia. So as crazy as it may sound and as heretical as it may sound, I actually have one there, and that's the one person in the whole world who I would send over to Athens. So somehow we've managed to deal with it, but we're a split family on that issue. But go Georgia Tech is where I'll leave it.
The things we do for our kids. All right, Todd, our
go.
last question is always the same. You have one final flight. We want to know, what are you flying and where are you going?
I'm going to take the Carbon Cub into the backcountry, no doubt. That'll be the low, slow, simple, in a Carbon Cub and a Cub in the backcountry. It's both the destination and the journey. So that's an easy one. That'll be the final one.
Todd, thanks for being on the podcast.
What a great privilege it's been to be with you today. Thanks for having me on your podcast. And I've really enjoyed the conversation, John. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to Pilot's Discretion, brought to you by Sporties, training and equipping pilots worldwide for over 60 years. For more episodes and today's show links, visit sporties.com/podcast. I'm John Zimmerman. We'll see you next time on Pilot's Discretion.